We'll continue from where we had left yesterday. That further, the manner of a poet may be purely narrative, as in the epic or representation through action, as in drama. Thus, different kinds of poetry differ from each other in their manner of imitation. Even dramatic poetry is differentiated into tragedy and comedy. Then we move further to objects of imitation. Nature of poetic imitation. As regards the object of imitation, Aristotle says that the objects of poetic imitation are men in action. The poet may imitate men as they were or are or as they ought to be. In other words, he may represent men either as better than in real life or as worse as they are. This means that according to Aristotle's theory, imitation is not mere photographic representation of the surface of things, but it is a creative process. The poet selects and orders his material and in this way recreates reality. He brings order out of chaos. The purely irrational or accidental is eliminated and the attention is focused on the permanent and the significant. He can represent men better than in real life. That is his idea of them, which might be based on material supplied by history and legend rather than by any living figure. Thus, he gives us a truth of an ideal or universal kind. He tells us not what men are, but what they can be or what they ought to be. His mind is not tied to reality. So, reality is not important, it is the representation of the reality that is important. It is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen. According to the laws of probability or necessity, history tells us what actually happened. Poetry, what may happen. This is the difference between history and poetry. History tells us what actually happened, and poetry tells us what may happen and what is likely to happen. Poetry tends to express the universal, history the particular. This is one of the most important difference between history and poetry. Poetry expresses the universal, history expresses the particular. In this way, he demonstrates the superiority of poetry over history. So, Aristotle explains that poetry is superior to history. The poet, free from the tyranny of facts, takes a larger or generalized view of things, represents the universal in and through the particular, and also shares the philosopher's quest for ultimate truth. There is a universal element in great poetry, hence its permanent appeal. He thus equates poetry with philosophy and shows that both are means to a higher truth. Both contribute to a better understanding of man and his life. By the word universal, Aristotle signifies how a person of a certain nature or type will, on a particular occasion, speak or act according to the law of probability or necessity. So, this is expressed in the words of Aristotle, translated from Greek into English. And this is the definition of universal given by Aristotle. Thus, the poet constantly rises from the particular to the general. So, the idea is to shift from particular to the general. He studies the particular and, on the basis of his study, devises principles of general application. The poet transcends the limit of real life without violating the essential law of human nature. So, as we move ahead uh, to another point, it is imitation of the creative process of nature. Elsewhere, Aristotle says art imitates nature, and in the Poetics, we are told the objects of imitation are men in action. In the former definition, he refers to the process of imitation by nature. Aristotle does not mean the outward world of creating things. He means the creative force, the productive principle of the universe. There is no question of a literal copy of the world of reality. Rather, what art seeks to reproduce is mainly an inward process, a psychical energy working outwards, deeds, incidents, events, situations being included under it. So far, these spring from an inward act of will or elicit some activity of thought or feeling. Man is the highest of the creatures. Here, Shakespeare's literature also comes to our mind, where he focused too much upon human mind and human psychology. So we can say that he took some inspiration from Aristotle, if not Aristotle, from the Greek dramatists and writers, because Shakespeare's prominence over human psychology and mind is noteworthy. Man is the highest of the creatures. He has within him an urge to rise upward, and it is this ceaseless upward striving which a poet imitates. He renders men as they ought to be, and he renders men as they ought to be.